Breaking news reverberated across the globe. Explosions thundered above the skies of Doha, lighting the horizon in a firestorm that no one in Qatar could have imagined. The world jolted to attention as the images flashed across every screen. Smoke rising over neighborhoods, people rushing through the streets, phones trembling in shaky hands recording the chaos. The Gulf, long seen as a stage of influence and power, was suddenly a battlefield once more. The anchors' voices cracked as they delivered the update. Israel had struck Qatar. For many, disbelief froze into silence. For others, outrage erupted instantly. In coffee shops and homes, in parliaments and embassies, whispers hardened into anger. How far would Netanyahu go? How many more lines would be crossed before the world said enough? And yet, in that silence after missiles, a different kind of tension began to build. Cameras panned across the world. Washington watching carefully. Paris caught in debate, African capitals waiting with a mix of fear and fury. Leaders traded phone calls behind closed doors. But it wasn't their voices that would seize history's microphone. Because somewhere, far from Doha, a young African leader was preparing words that would carry more force than a barrage of rockets. Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier turned president, the voice who had already unsettled neo-colonial powers with his raw defiance, was about to speak. The stage of global politics had seen countless statements, predictable condemnations, carefully measured diplomatic language. But this would not be one of them. Traoré had no script crafted by careful aides, no fear of offending the world's mighty. His words would not be polished for comfort. They would be sharpened for truth. And as the footage of burning skies in Qatar replayed, the question rippled. Who would dare stand against Netanyahu now? Nations hesitated, their condemnation soft, their warnings diluted. It seemed no one would risk defying a man who had built his career on power, on force, on daring the world to challenge him. But then, in that gathering silence, came a moment no one expected. From the heart of Africa, a voice rose with unflinching clarity. One voice from Africa would echo louder than missiles. And Netanyahu never saw it coming. The strike on Qatar was not merely another episode in the long and bloody chess game of Middle Eastern geopolitics. It was something different, something sharper, more dangerous. Qatar was not at war, not firing missiles, not preparing tanks. It was a nation of glass towers and diplomatic bridges, suddenly staring at fire in its skies. The world had grown accustomed to Israeli strikes against traditional foes, but this was a line crossed that unsettled even those who once applauded Netanyahu's bravado. In an instant, the air was heavy with questions that demanded answers. Was anywhere safe from escalation? If a Gulf capital known for its wealth, its diplomacy, its neutrality could be struck, what did that mean for smaller nations, for weaker voices, for those without armies of iron and fleets of drones? The fear was not limited to Qatar's borders. Across the global south, leaders and citizens alike felt the tremor. If they can do this to Doha, they can do it to anyone. And so the fault lines deepened. On one side stood Netanyahu, weathered but unrelenting, a man whose political survival had long been built on defiance, on outlasting criticism, on turning outrage into a weapon. His was a face of arrogance cloaked as strength, a figure who believed that as long as he acted with boldness, the world would grumble but ultimately submit. On the other side, there emerged a new kind of leader, younger, unpolished, but resonating with a rawness that people craved in an age of scripted statements. Ibrahim Traoré was not meant to be a global voice. He was supposed to be a soldier guarding his homeland, a president of one of Africa's poorest countries. Yet it was precisely that background that made his words impossible to dismiss. Where others balanced their language on fragile alliances, he had nothing to lose by speaking the truth. This was no longer a question of borders. It was a question of dignity versus domination. It was the eternal clash. One man's belief that might makes right against another man's conviction that truth makes history. Netanyahu wielded power as if it were eternal. Traoré, with only his words, promised to wield something far greater. The spirit of resistance, a defiance against those who mistake silence for submission. And so the cameras lingered. Analysts whispered. Citizens scrolled their feeds, desperate for something to break through the fog of fear. The leaders of the world had spoken in muted tones, repeating the same old vocabulary: concern, de-escalation, dialogue. But none of it rang true. None of it answered the questions burning in people's minds. It was in that vacuum of courage that Traoré's voice began to matter even before he spoke. The world did not need another politician hiding behind diplomatic shields. It needed fire. It needed truth. It needed someone willing to point directly at Netanyahu's arrogance and say what others fear to say. And that, more than anything, is why this moment mattered. Because it was not about Qatar alone. It was about every nation that had ever been told to stay quiet. It was about every citizen who had been forced to swallow their anger while watching power trample dignity. It was about the timeless struggle between those who dominate because they can and those who resist because they must. But when Traoré stepped forward, the entire narrative flipped. For decades, Benjamin Netanyahu had fashioned himself as a master of survival, the leader who could outwit enemies abroad and rivals at home. He thrived on the politics of confrontation, cultivating the image of a man unafraid to act when others hesitated. His history was marked by militarism, by calculated defiance of global norms, by an insistence that Israel's security justified every strike, every breach, every silence imposed on critics. To his supporters, this made him strong. To his detractors, it made him dangerous. The pattern was always the same. A flash of violence, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, followed by the carefully rehearsed justification. Netanyahu would step before cameras, chin high, eyes cold, speaking in a language of inevitability. We had no choice. We acted to defend ourselves. And the world, even when outraged, often fell back into the familiar script. Condemnations from the United Nations, protests on city streets, a cycle of fury that always seemed to fade. Netanyahu understood this cycle better than anyone. He counted on it. Critics called it arrogance. And perhaps it was. Again and again, he dismissed not only the anger of those outside Israel's borders, but also the moral concerns raised by allies within. Washington might caution restraint. Europe might issue strong words. But Netanyahu's calculation was simple. Words without consequences were not threats. They were noise. And noise, no matter how loud, could be endured until it faded. There was a hypocrisy woven through his justifications. He spoke of security, of protecting Israel from existential threats, while at the same time launching strikes that destabilized entire regions. He insisted on the right to defend his people, yet seemed indifferent to the civilians beyond his borders who lived under the shadow of his air raids. For every speech that invoked Israel's right to exist, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of others' right to suffer. Yet Netanyahu's political genius lay in how he turned even criticism into strength. Every time a protest broke out, every time the UN issued another resolution, he pointed to it as proof that Israel was under siege, not only from rockets but from rhetoric, from what he cast as unfair global judgment. He had built a career on positioning himself as a lone defender against a hostile world, a fortress of defiance standing tall against waves of disapproval. And for years, the formula worked. His enemies feared him, his allies enabled him, and his people often rallied behind him when he projected strength. Netanyahu learned to lean into that persona, the man who could do what others only dare to discuss, the leader who would strike first and argue later. He carried himself with the assurance of one who believed he had mastered not just politics but history itself. But there was a cost to that confidence. The longer he relied on arrogance as strategy, the more he convinced himself that no one would truly stand against him. Leaders in Europe and America would scold him. Yes, but they would continue to trade, to ally, to fund. Regional rivals might rage, but they lacked the power to confront him directly. In Netanyahu's eyes, the stage was his alone to command. He had weathered storms before, and he believed he could weather them forever. And then came Qatar, a strike on a Gulf state so tightly woven into diplomacy, so central to dialogue, that even some of Israel's quiet partners could not easily explain it away. Netanyahu doubled down, confident once again that outrage would burn bright, but fast. He believed that the cycle would repeat. Condemnation, debate, eventual silence. He believed that no leader would risk shattering the unwritten rules by calling him out too boldly, too directly. Yet history has a way of humbling those who believe they are untouchable. Netanyahu could not imagine that the most defiant challenge would not come from Washington, nor Paris, nor even from Doha itself. It would come from somewhere he did not expect, from a voice he had not calculated into his equations of power. Because while Netanyahu prepared to outlast the storm, a young African leader was preparing to speak, and his words would strike harder than any missile. Ibrahim Traoré would prove him wrong. Long before his name echoed across the chambers of international politics, Ibrahim Traoré was a soldier, a young man in fatigues, hardened not by privilege but by the reality of nations struggling under the weight of exploitation and uncertainty. Born in Burkina Faso, one of the world's poorest nations, he came of age in a land too often treated as a pawn on someone else's chessboard. For decades, foreign powers dictated the rules, extracting resources, enforcing dependency, and reminding Africans, in subtle and brutal ways, that sovereignty was a promise rarely fulfilled. Traoré carried this truth with him into the army. Life as a soldier demanded discipline, sacrifice, and endurance, but also demanded something deeper, a resilience against humiliation. He saw first-hand frustration of ordinary people, their voices drowned by leaders too timid to challenge neo-colonial masters. In the villages where he served, he witnessed the hunger of children, the quiet despair of families forced to survive on crumbs while their soil yielded riches for outsiders. The injustice burned into him like a scar. What made him different was not only his anger, but his resolve. Many young men feel fury at injustice. Few turn it into action. Traoré studied, trained, and prepared with the patience of one who knew his time would come. And when that time arrived, it was swift and unapologetic. In 2022, amid deepening instability, he rose unexpectedly to the presidency through a military-led change of power. He was just 34 years old, the youngest leader in Africa. For his critics, this was cause for skepticism. For his supporters, it was a breath of life. At last, here was a leader not weighed down by decades of political compromises, but sharpened by the clarity of a soldier's eye. From his earliest days in office, Traoré signaled that he was not content to repeat history, where others bowed politely before Western powers. He spoke bluntly. Where others accepted foreign troops on African soil as inevitability, he declared they were no longer welcome. He refused to let Burkina Faso remain a playground for forces who cloaked exploitation in the language of aid and security. His speeches bristled with defiance. Africa, he declared, must stand on its own feet. Sovereignty was not a slogan. It was survival. That message resonated not only in Burkina Faso, but across a continent weary of broken promises. Youth in Dakar, Lagos, Bamako, and Kinshasa began to chant his name. Social media turned his image into a symbol of a new generation, one that would no longer accept the colonial posture of deference. He became, in the eyes of many, the embodiment of a long-suppressed dream, that Africa could speak in its own voice, not as a subject, but as an equal. Yet Traoré's journey was not without struggle. Critics in Europe dismissed him as reckless. Analysts warned that his boldness would isolate his nation. Journalists labeled him a populist, a soldier out of place in politics. But those words mattered little to him. He had already seen what silence brought: poverty, dependency, humiliation. If boldness was dangerous, he would embrace it, because silence was far deadlier. And so, as months passed, his defiance crystallized into vision. Traoré spoke not just of Burkina Faso's independence, but of a continental awakening. He rejected the chains of neocolonialism, but he also extended a hand to nations across Africa, urging them to rediscover pride in their sovereignty. He cast himself not as a lone warrior, but as a representative of the voiceless, the millions who've been told to accept their fate quietly. His words gave language to their frustrations, and his courage gave them hope. The contrast between him and figures like Netanyahu could not have been sharper. Netanyahu wielded missiles. Traoré wielded memory. Netanyahu spoke the language of dominance. Traoré spoke the language of dignity. One was anchored in decades of arrogance, the other in the discipline of a soldier who had risen not by privilege but by will. The international elite underestimated him. They assumed a young leader from a small, landlocked nation could not influence the world stage. But Traoré was not speaking to them. He was speaking to the restless, the unheard, the silenced. And in a world tired of polished statements and careful half-truths, his raw defiance traveled further than power ever imagined. So when the strike on Qatar lit up the skies and rattled the global order, leaders across Europe and America scrambled to craft measured responses. Diplomats debated. Statements were drafted. Caution dictated every word. But Ibrahim Traoré did not need a committee to write his truth. He had already lived it, carried it, and sharpened in the fire of his own struggle. And so, when the strike on Qatar sent shockwaves, Traoré did not hesitate. The hours after the strike were a blur of statements, tweets, and hurried press conferences. World leaders scrambled to respond, each weighing their words with the precision of diplomats afraid of tipping the scales too far. Some remained conspicuously silent, choosing to monitor the situation rather than condemn. Others issued cautious remarks of concern, their sentences wrapped in the sterile language of international diplomacy. De-escalation, they urged. Dialogue, they pleaded. Yet none dared to name Netanyahu directly. In Washington, officials spoke in hushed tones about the complex security environment. In Brussels, leaders drafted statements that condemned violence in principle without ever addressing its source. The Arab League gathered in emergency session, but even their declarations seemed more measured than the moment demanded. Rage flickered across social media, but from podiums and parliaments, there was hesitation. Hesitation born of alliances, of dependence, of fear of what Netanyahu might unleash if cornered. Meanwhile, Netanyahu himself was not hesitating. He was doubling down. Standing before cameras with his characteristic blend of sternness and smirk, he dismissed criticism as naive, even dangerous. The strike, he insisted, was a matter of survival. Qatar, he claimed, had allowed hostile networks to fester. Israel had acted, he declared, as any responsible nation would. He was louder than his critics, and in that volume, he found power. Every question from a journalist was deflected with the same rehearsed lines about security. Every condemnation from abroad was framed as proof that Israel was under siege, that the world would never understand the necessity of decisive action. His words carried the weight of practiced defiance, the confidence of man who believed the outrage would fade, as it always had before. But underneath the noise, something was shifting. The cycle of outrage and silence felt thinner this time, less convincing, less durable. For ordinary people watching from their living rooms, the spectacle of leaders tripping over their own words of caution felt insulting. The people saw fire in Doha skies, but all they heard were diplomatic whispers. They wanted more. They needed more. And yet, still, no leader had stepped forward with the clarity to cut through the fog. The United Nations issued calls for restraint. European leaders tiptoed around Netanyahu's name. Regional allies balanced their anger with their dependence. The world seemed locked in hesitation, as if waiting for someone to say what everyone already knew, but no one dared to declare. The tension only grew as Netanyahu's voice grew louder. He mocked critics for their cowardice, warned that Israel would strike again if necessary, and painted himself as a lone defender of order in a chaotic region. For him, every microphone was an opportunity. Every criticism another excuse to brandish strength. But arrogance has its limits. His confidence, once a shield, was beginning to look like a mask. And for all his defiance, there was an emptiness in the air, the absence of a counterweight, a challenger, a voice that would not cower before his rhetoric. The stage was set. The missiles had spoken. The world had reacted, but not enough. Netanyahu had roared, but no one had yet answered with a force to silence him. The silence of leaders was deafening, their caution almost complicit. It seemed as if no one would risk the fury of standing up to him. And then, as the world's attention began to drift between outrage and resignation, a new voice prepared to rise. Not from Washington, not from Paris, not even from Doha, but from Ouagadougou in the heart of Africa. And when Ibrahim Traoré spoke, his words cut through the noise like a blade. The world had been waiting, even if it did not know it. After hours of diplomatic hesitation and Netanyahu's relentless justifications, the void in global leadership felt almost unbearable. And then, from Ouagadougou, the youngest president in Africa stepped forward, not with bluster, not with theatrics, but with a calm that carried more weight than any missile. Ibrahim Traoré's face filled the broadcast screens. Steady, unflinching, eyes sharp of conviction. His voice began softly, almost measured, yet beneath it was an authority that made even the restless quiet down. "Tonight," he began, "the world has witnessed aggression. Aggression carried out against a sovereign state. Aggression that rattled not only the Gulf, but the conscience of all free people." He paused, the silence drawing listeners in. There was no trembling, no uncertainty. His tone was that of a man not pleading for recognition, but asserting what was already true. Let's be clear, no nation, no matter its history or its alliances, has a right to rain destruction upon another in the name of arrogance. Qatar is not alone tonight. Africa is not silent. Humanity itself must not be silent. Already the atmosphere shifted. In living rooms, in cafes, in parliaments, people leaned closer to their screens. There was a cadence to his words that demanded attention, not theatrical, but elemental, as though he were speaking not only as a president, but as a witness for the voiceless. He continued, "For too long, some have believed they could act without consequence, trampling sovereignty, destabilizing regions, dismissing the cries of the innocent as collateral noise. They speak of security while creating insecurity. They speak of peace while dealing in destruction. But let us tell the truth tonight. What was done to Qatar is not strength. It is weakness disguised as power." A murmur rippled through the chamber where diplomats and leaders were gathered. Even through television feeds, one could feel the shift, the air tightening, the certainty in Netanyahu's camp beginning to waver. Traoré's voice deepened. "Africa knows what it means to be silenced. We have lived through the centuries of chains, of exploitation, of foreign hands deciding our fate. But those days are ending. No longer will Africa lower its gaze while arrogance tramples dignity. Tonight, I stand with Qatar, not only as an African, but as a human being who refuses to accept a world ruled by missiles instead of morals." The words carried with them the weight of history. He was not only speaking of Doha's skies, he was speaking of colonized lands, of exploited nations, of every people who had ever been told their suffering was necessary for someone else's security. The camera cut to Netanyahu, watching from his office. His expression, once firm and unmoved, betrayed the smallest shift, a tightening jaw, a narrow gaze. For the first time, the Israeli leader looked less like the unshakable master of the stage, and more like a man being called out, stripped of protective shield of his rhetoric. Traoré pressed on, his delivery calm but rising in intensity. "Let no one mistake silence for consent. Let no one believe that the absence of condemnation is the presence of approval. Africa has been silent before, but not today. Not when sovereignty is attacked so brazenly. Not when arrogance cloaks itself as necessity." His words struck with the precision of a surgeon and the power of a hammer. Around the world, news outlets interrupted their programming to carry his speech in full. Commentators sat in stunned quiet, letting the gravity of his message echo before daring to analyze it. And then came the moment, the line that would be replayed again and again, etched into history. Traoré leaned slightly forward, his tone unshakable. "Your missiles may silence cities," he declared, "but they cannot silence dignity." The chamber froze. Journalists scribbled furiously, but even they looked up, caught in the power of the sentence. Across continents, people shared it instantly, turning it into headlines, into banners, into chants. In Doha, crowds erupted in cheers. In capitals across Africa, the line spread like fire. It was not just a sentence. It was a verdict. The camera lingered briefly on Netanyahu. He shifted in his seat, lips pressed tightly, his usual quick retorts momentarily absent. For once, the Israeli leader, long practiced in shrugging off criticism, looked unsettled. But Traoré was not finished. He allowed the silence to hang, then continued with the same calm certainty. Dignity does not burn. Dignity does not shatter under bombs. Dignity cannot be erased by those who fear it most. And tonight, from Africa to Asia, from the Gulf to the Americas, the world remembers this truth. Dignity belongs to people, not to the powerful who try to suppress it. The rhythm of his words was deliberate, each phrase crafted to cut deeper than the last. There was no shouting, no gesturing. The power came from restraint, from the clarity of a man who knew his message needed no embellishment. And so, he said, his eyes steady, we stand with Qatar. We stand with every nation that has been humiliated by aggression disguised as necessity. And we remind the arrogant, the world may have been silent yesterday, but it will not remain silent forever. Not while voices rise from the very places you once ignored. Not while nations once dismissed, as weak begin to show what true strength means. He let the words breathe, then delivered his closing. History will not remember the missiles. It will remember the dignity that stood unbroken, and it will remember who spoke when silence was demanded. Africa has spoken tonight, and we will not be ignored. The feed cut across networks. Anchors left scrambling to react. Analysts debated the geopolitical implications, but ordinary people heard something simpler: truth. In that moment, Netanyahu was no longer the sole voice dominating the narrative. His justifications, so confident hours earlier, now sounded hollow. A new voice had entered the arena, and it carried with it not just rhetoric, but resonance. The world had waited for a counterpunch, and Traoré had delivered it. Not with missiles, not with threats, but with words that disarmed arrogance itself. The impact of those words was immediate and unstoppable. The moment Traoré's speech concluded, the world did what it does best in the digital age. It exploded. Within minutes, clips of his address flooded timelines across every platform. On X, the hashtag Dignity Over Missiles began trending globally, joined by hashtag Africa Speaks and hashtag Traoré. Memes, edits, and subtitle reels circulated faster than the official transcripts could be published. One viral video paired his line: "Your missiles may silence cities, but they cannot silence dignity," with images of children in Gaza, families in Doha, and liberation movements from decades past. It was less a political statement than a rallying cry, a truth that crossed borders with the speed of light. In Africa, the response was immediate and emotional. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Dakar to Johannesburg, young people reposted his words with a sense of pride that felt personal. Finally, one user wrote, "An African leader speaks for us all." University students painted banners with his quote, while musicians sampled his speech in freestyle tracks uploaded overnight. For a generation often told their continent had no voice, here was proof, not only of a voice, but of one powerful enough to rattle the walls of global politics. In the Arab world, the reaction was no less electric. Qatari citizens filled the streets in spontaneous gatherings, chanting his name alongside their own leaders. Commentators on Al Jazeera described Traoré as a brother in struggle and the African lion who roared when others cowered. Across Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, and beyond, hashtags in Arabic translated to "Traoré spoke for us." A bond of solidarity, Africa with the Arab world, seemed to crystallize in real time. The Western media scrambled to respond. CNN framed it as an unprecedented intervention from Africa's youngest leader. The BBC noted how his calm composure contrasted with Netanyahu's increasingly defensive tone. French outlets, often dismissive of African defiance, found themselves caught between critique and admiration. Meanwhile, social media influencers, from Black Lives Matter activists in the U.S. to pro-Palestinian organizers in Europe, amplified his word with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like." And then came the memes. Netanyahu's uncomfortable shuffle was looped endlessly, captioned with lines like, "When the youngest president in Africa schools you on dignity." Others showed Traoré's portrait overlaid with the phrase, "Missiles fall, dignity stands." TikTokers stitched his speech into motivational edits, cutting between sports highlights, protest marches, and scenes of everyday resilience. It was more than a political moment. It was a cultural one. Commentators rushed to define it. Some called a turning point in African diplomacy. Others went further, suggested it was the first time since the non-aligned movement of the Cold War that Africa had spoken with such clarity on the global stage. This is not just about Israel and Qatar, one analyst on MSNBC said. This is about Africa refusing to remain silent in the margins of history. But the impact wasn't only online or in think tanks. On the ground, ordinary people felt it. In Burkina Faso, School teachers reported students quoting Traoré's line in classrooms. In Ghana, market vendors proudly told reporters they stayed up all night watching the clips. In Sudan, where conflict had left many feeling forgotten, his words gave a sense that someone, somewhere, was still willing to speak for the oppressed. The ripple effects even reached Israel itself. Opposition politicians seized on Netanyahu's shaken image, arguing that his foreign policy had not only isolated Israel, but now emboldened leaders far beyond the Middle East. For the first time, critics suggested an African head of state had managed to dent Netanyahu's carefully cultivated aura of untouchability. And yet, as powerful as the headlines and hashtags were, something deeper stirred beneath the surface. The resonance of Traoré's words was not just about their immediate political impact. It was about identity, about sovereignty, about a continent reclaiming its role in shaping the moral debates of the world. People weren't only sharing a speech, they were sharing pride. They weren't only mocking Netanyahu's discomfort, they were celebrating an African leader who had stood tall when the world expected him to stay quiet. It was the kind of moment that could not be measured in trending charts alone. For while social media roared and headlines flashed, beneath it all was a quieter, more enduring truth. A shift in how millions viewed themselves, their leaders, and their place in the global story. And that shift, subtle but profound, was only just beginning, because beyond the hashtags, beyond the praise, beyond the memes and the cheers, something deeper was happening. In the hours and days that followed, it became clear that Traoré's words were more than a fiery response to a single strike. They had tapped into something older, something deeper, a truth that resonated far beyond Qatar, far beyond Israel, and even beyond Africa itself. They spoke to the universal hunger for dignity. Dignity is stronger than domination. Justice outlives bombs. Those lines, repeated in classrooms, on protest placards, in songs and sermons, distilled a principle humanity has long yearned for, that no empire, no missile, no machinery of intimidation can outlast the human spirit's demand for justice. This was not just about geopolitics. It was about identity, memory, and the future. The global South, nations once silenced, colonized, or treated as pawns in other people's games, had been reminded of its own power. Traoré's defiance was not couched in apologies or compromise. It was clear, unbending, rooted in the belief that sovereignty and justice belong to all nations, not just a few who wield the largest arsenals. Around the world, commentators began speaking of a shift, the global South finding its voice not as scattered whispers, but as a chorus. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, leaders and citizens echoed Traoré's defiance. "We are not spectators of history," one Brazilian journalist wrote. "We are authors of it." And perhaps that was the deeper resonance of the moment. Courage as contagious. His words carried the reminder that even the smallest nation, even the youngest leader, could stand tall against the largest powers and still command the attention of the world. For the immigrant, watching from afar, there was a reminder of home, of cultures and communities often demeaned, yet rich with resilience. For the young activist, there was a lesson in strategy, that sometimes the sharpest weapon is not rage, but calm, unshakable clarity. For entire continents, there was an affirmation that unity is not a dream, but a decision. What Netanyahu dismissed as rhetoric was quickly revealed as something heavier, a moral anchor. Bombs can crumble buildings. Drones can scorch deserts. But words that strike at the core of human dignity endure far longer than military campaigns. They outlive the generals, the politicians, even the empires. And so, Traoré's intervention became more than a headline. It became a symbol, a reminder that in the great struggle between domination and dignity, history eventually sides with those who choose justice. The lesson was simple but profound. Missiles may silence cities, but they cannot silence truth. Arrogance may bend the news cycle, but it cannot bend the arc of human longing for freedom. And when one leader dares to speak, it invites others to do the same, until silence is broken not by explosions, but by solidarity. This, then, is what endures, not the roar of fighter jets, not the claims of arrogance dressed up as security, but the echo of words that remind people of their worth. And in that echo lies a challenge, for the audience, for nations, for every individual, to stand, to speak, to refuse to be cowed by those who mistake fear for power. Because in the end, the missiles will fade into silence. The smoke will clear. The headlines will move on. But Ibrahim Traoré's words still echo. Ibrahim Traoré responds to Israel's strike on Qatar shocks Netanyahu. And now you understand why. The missiles rattled the skies, but it was not the sound of explosions that defined this moment. It was a calm defiance of a young African leader who dared to speak when others stayed silent. Netanyahu, long the master of dismissing critics, found himself shaken not by armies or sanctions, but by words that exposed the hollowness of aggression, words that reminded the world that dignity cannot be bombed into silence. Once again, arrogance tried to roar, and once again, truth answered louder. This is more than politics. This is a story of humanity's eternal struggle. Domination versus dignity, intimidation versus justice. And tonight, justice stood taller. If you believe in stories like this, where courage rises above fear, where leaders remind us of who we are and what we deserve, then this is your community. Subscribe to witness more moments where dignity silences arrogance. And don't keep this story to yourself. Share this video, because the world deserves justice over domination, truth over propaganda, and leaders who inspire us instead of divide us. Together, we can make sure voices like Traoré's echo far beyond one speech, one night, one headline. Because while missiles fade into silence, dignity endures. And the next confrontation may change the course of history.